The text that I prepared for today does not have any fancy images, but what I'm trying to do, it's a work in progress text that weaves together present, past, and future Dutch global water politics, and it will be a mix of like academic research and narrative form. So thank you for bearing with me. In the summer of 2021, I returned to Amsterdam after a two-year research stay abroad. On my first walk through the city, I noticed how many of the famous canals and bridges were under construction. Some of the bridges were completely closed off, and the streets along the canals were blocked by containers and heavy building equipment. The docks looked wavier than usual, and large sheets of metal were erected in the water at about a 2 or 3 meter distance from the docks. The space between the dock and the metal was filled with sand. As in any expanding urban city, there's always construction. However, I'd never seen anything like it. And why did it look like some of the streets were slanting and crumbling into the canal? Even the canal houses seemed more wonkier than ever. Continuing on my walk, I found a sign explaining that the bridges and streets had been poorly maintained and were collapsing, sinking under the weight of water from below in a city built almost entirely on what they call reclaimed land, as if it was supposed to be there all along. A wetland ecosystem turned into property. I remember thinking to myself, this is the end of the long so-called golden age, a beautiful yet morbid end of empire. My mind's eye pictured the signature houses along the Amsterdam canals, built with the money and resources from the colonies and slave plantations, crumbling into the water. Although centuries had gone into containing, capturing, and juridicalizing the water's materiality remembered where it was and spilled out. Coming back to reality, I sighed and thought, those metal sheets, another quick fix solution to postpone what might be the city's inevitable demise, as I scrutinized the rust chipping of metal. The metal sheets were placed to support the old brick structures and the marshy sand underneath them. The metal looked like an unmoving wave, leaving space between the familiar murky brown-green water and the dock. In those in-between zones, there was hardly any water, just sand blanketed by a small layer of liquid from incessant summer rains and already getting sucked up by layers of pulverized shell, as if the sand from the dike between land and water. The whole scene reminded me of 17th century land reclamation, or perhaps more pertinently, land-taking projects occurring all across this Rhine River delta. The Dutch were building land where there was none and claimed it as a nation, claiming possession over what was once wet. Dredging, dumping, draining, the water becoming more and more invisible, yet never truly gone. The river, the shoreline, coming and going, coming and going, coming. In the sand, small shoots of native greenery were sprouting, interrupting the otherwise familiar shades of brown. A municipal sign instructed me, please keep off, newly sown flower beds. I felt cheated. The whole city was collapsing under the weight of its man-made land, and the municipality tried to tell me this was some sort of community gardening project. New seeds are sown, but to what extent is this a rupture with the not-so-distant past? The little sprigs and bushes sprouting up from the expanded sandboxes are but a temporary solution, masked as a contemporary turn in Dutch water management policy geared towards neoliberal sustainability and so-called resilience. This illusion of sustainability is more about sustaining a Dutch way of life than about degrowth or decolonization. In other words, also a politics and poetics of water that does not operate in the service or under the protectorate of Dutch mankind. The summer scene captures a familiar trope running through the history of this liquid nation. The Dutch are always already living under threat of floods, while at the same time they have learned how to live below sea level, mastering hydraulic engineering and navigating the so-called seven seas, all the while promoting a Calvinist model of accumulation sold as a heroic tale of divine trade and navigation. A Dutch East India Company mentality our former Prime Minister Jan Peter Balkenende would like to return to. a model grounded in a system of conquest, slavery and dispossession abroad, and exploitation at home disguised as trade, a viable alternative to the Iberian mission. For centuries, the Dutch had been transforming their entire ecosystem by changing river deltas, tracts of sea, and bays into brackish water and erecting entire cities and agricultural land upon a historically marshy and riverine landscape. Today, the largest maritime business cluster, Maritime by Holland, claims that this same maritime sector functions as a vibrant ecosystem. Hydraulic engineering, land taking, extraction, and navigation have now become an ecosystem of their own, overriding the natural elements of water and land, but never fully. The supposed naturalness of this vibrant ecosystem, rooted in a narrative of Dutch exceptionalism, can be traced back to the beginnings of Dutch overseas expansion. It would be impossible to talk about the ways in which the Dutch claimed the water as a nation and exported its business models through colonization, slavery, and what Vishwa Satkar calls imperial ecocide, without thinking about Dutch East India Company lawyer, early modern humanist, and state and empire ideologue Hugo Grazius, whom the Dutch affectionately call Hugo or Hugo de Groot. When I ask Dutch people if they know Hugo de Groot, people often remember the heroic tale of his escape to France in a book trunk in 1621. He continues to be portrayed today as some kind of a folk hero. However, few people know that his work has been central to ideologies of Dutch state formation and European legal doctrines of imperialism. For instance, John Locke's justification for British colonization in North America, or Turtle Island, was deeply impacted by Grotius' res nullius doctrine. In other words, the idea that you can claim ownership over a tract of land by bordering and cultivating it, as it is otherwise considered ownerless property in weight of possession. In my current book project, I Own, Therefore I Am, the global afterlives of Hugo Grotius' propertied subject, I examine how colonial and racial difference inform Grotius' understanding of the human as a propertied subject, a world-making definition and a key hegemonic concept today. This book project emerged from my postdoctoral research, Maritime Imagination, a cultural oceanography of Dutch imperialism and its aftermath. In the book, I aim to discuss 4 different sites where Grotius links the human to property in order to justify Dutch imperialist expansion. These sites are Dutchness, slavery, indigenous dispossession, and the ocean. The book tries to dismantle what I call the Grotian imaginary and exposes its impact on past and present racial, gendered, classed, and environmental imaginaries and legalities. I explore the afterlives of Grotius' propertied subject to show how the Grotian imaginary proved foundational to the development and entrenchment of what Cedric Robinson has called racial capitalism, and intervene in narratives of trade and navigation that continue to dominate Dutch historiography and self-perception. Furthermore, the book aims to provincialize Grotius and contribute to urgent public debates on the aftermath of colonialism, slavery, and ecocide in the Netherlands. The ocean takes up a specific place within the context of Dutch imperialism. In 1609, Hugo Grozius crafted the notion of mare liberum, or the free sea, to justify Dutch imperial expansion. Although the ocean cannot be owned by an individual or a state, he argued, it was at the service of mankind. In his manuscript on the affairs of the Indies, which formed the backbone for his mare liberum, he distinguished between 2 different classes of res nullius, there we have it again, ownerless property, when the ocean was concerned. In the first class, fish and other marine resources were considered res nullius until captured by an individual or a state. The ocean and the shore, according to him, were of a different class of res nullius. They could not be owned by an individual or a state, but they were the common possession of all mankind, which of course here meant European and preferably Dutch merchantmen. The ocean itself was therefore of a different temporality, namely that of perpetually ownerless property, where the private ownership of the ocean remained forever deferred. However, it remained the common property of mankind. In one fell swoop, then, Grotius reduced the ocean to the status of a thing, replete with its own capitalist legal rationalization. What strikes me is that Grotius' thingification of the ocean has colonized our thinking about the ocean and international law and continues to be felt today. In international law, for instance, the ocean continues to be considered the common heritage of mankind. What this produces is an anthropocentric notion of the commons that turns the biosphere and everything upon it into a resource in the surface of humans, mostly white humans. Here, capital accumulation. At the same time, the ocean's very materiality seems to resist Grotius' own legal narrative. Although Grotius' conquest of maritime imagination continues to justify global models of capital accumulation, the ocean always already shores up against and spills out of such reductive imaginaries. And I use the term conquest of maritime imagination here deliberately to describe how Grotius' vision of the ocean has come to occupy and capture our relationship to the planet. What I find interesting is that it is within Grotius' own work that we can already see the ways in which water exceeds and spills out of his reductive fiction, or what Renisa Mawani has called an elemental cum legal distinction between land and sea. The sea itself becomes an active actor in Grotius' writings, who, much like man, he writes, diverted things from use and made its own, such as the sand of the sea, of which the portion merging onto the land is called the shore. Because the shore, as it were, was claimed as part of the property of the ocean, the shore as a whole could not be subjected to a regime of private property. Grotius even went as far as to argue that where the sea seems to resist possession like a wild beast, and I quote him here, who can no longer be considered property of its captor after retaining its natural liberty, the shore seems to return to the sea under the principle of post-liminium. Here he seems to imply that the ocean, under post-liminium, has a right to recover what has been stolen or lost, a right never applicable to the enslaved or colonized, by the way. He further asserted that the banks of sand cannot be owned not simply because the sand returns to the ocean, but because the shore is, and I quote him here again, incapable of culture, and serves only to supply man with sand, but can never be exhausted. Although Grotius perhaps meant here that the shore could not be cultivated, it might be productive to read uncultivated and uncultured together through the larger prism of conquest, as they both facilitated colonial expansion, plantation slavery, and imperial ecocide. This section is perhaps one of the most direct ways in which Grotius assigns the sand to its inexhaustible use for land reclamation or land takings projects. For Grotius, the shore constituted neither land nor water, its ground too unstable to fall under the category of private ownership or landed sovereignty. On the one hand, this conception of the shore led European powers to enter and conquer foreign territories. At the same time, Grotius' descriptions of the shore are reminiscent of the Dutch waterscape. Even today, the sinking docks and bridges remind me of the water speaking back to its legal and material confinements. The city is built on sand after all. Grotius' conception of the shore as taken and given by, or perhaps belonging to, the ocean reveals that his understanding of the elemental cum legal distinction between land and sea is not as clear-cut as it has been made out to be. On the one hand, this allows him to claim the shore as common, as a means to enable Dutch ships to penetrate distant shores, and on the other hand, this leaves me space to consider the ocean from another vantage point. It is particularly his understanding of the shore as a hybrid, or perhaps amphibious legal zone between land and sea, and I borrow from Renisa Mawani, that reveals the conceptual ambivalence of Grotius' argument. Flood and immersion, always on the horizon. Such an image of the shore as a liminal space shows that the elemental and juridical distinction between land and sea, or between different elements, cannot be as easily drawn. It also demands a different relationship to the water and the ocean that does not rest on either property or the commons. I find Grotius' idea of the ocean taking back reclaiming itself helpful, as it spills out and shores up against his own attempts to capture the service of the world for imperialist navigation and trade, the ocean as a resource for humans. The blue planet speaks back to regimes of property and capture. It speaks up through rising sea levels and ocean acidification. The ocean can take back what was taken, rendering unstable any claims that can be made, any boundary that might be drawn. Nowhere do we perhaps see this more clearly than in dammed and controlled coastal environments where the water continues to reclaim itself, such as in the city of Amsterdam. When sand no longer holds the weight of brick and metal, water refuses a long history of racial capitalist violence. When water trickles through, the city sinks. Even the sand itself is part of an intricate play between water, movement, shell, rock, and crustaceans. Amsterdam is built on the pulverized remains of a bazillion ancient exoskeletons. The ocean's materiality is always already in excess of Grotian legal claims. The ocean resists its signification in the service of global capitalism. It devours ships, it reclaims land for itself, it coughs up sand when it wants to, it regurgitates our pollution and spits it out as acid rain. It is the ocean's more than wet ontology, and I borrow from Steinberg and Peters, that trickles into Grotius' legal imaginary, even as he seems to erect a juridical fortress and impose a perspective of the ocean that turns it into an element in the service of European navigation and maritime supremacy. The properties of the ocean are in excess of its status as common heritage, or should I say common property of mankind. The limitations of a Grotian maritime imaginary that continues to capture dominant international legal, cultural, ontological, economic, and political deliberations begs the question, how can we rethink elemental relations, refuse the logic of property, and abolish a Grotian maritime imagination? Where do we think from? How do we write about water and act upon water so as to not perpetuate its status as a commodity, either private or common? How do we write about environmental justice in a way that foregrounds already existing non-Eurocentric and non-capitalist relations to the planet? What might this mean for contemporary international deliberations on the status of the sea that seem to suggest that a so-called area of the ocean can be protected, while another area is being prepared for the largely unknown project of deep-sea mining by the world's richest and most powerful corporations and corporate states, sponsored by the International Seabed Authority as a steward? And I place the we between brackets here, because the uneven responsibility for and effects of the long environmental crisis of what Françoise Vergès calls the racial capitalocene we find ourselves in must be contemplated as we try to form and understand alternative, future, and existing relations to the biosphere that do not rest on thingification. Viable climate imaginaries, then, cannot be white. In May 2022, I was asked to join a panel on brackish methodologies organized by Jeff Diamanti, who's somewhere here, and Fred Carter, that centered on the Dutch waterscape. On the panel, I was joined by benthic ecologist Arie Vonk. What struck me was that much of our thinking about water was alike, where I talked about how Dutch maritime imaginaries turned colonial capitalism into its own ecosystem. He studied the ecosystem in the Netherlands and talked about the environmental damages that occur as a result of damming, reclaiming, and confining water. He described how, contrary to Dutch strategies of separating and compartmentalizing the environment, marking hard separations between land and sea, organisms in brackish estuaries embrace their conditions, moving in and along the ecosystem. Land taking and marine engineering create a static ecosystem where the benthic system thrives on movement of fresh and salt water and rain. His work as a researcher to protect and understand this ecosystem collides with the maritime capitalist ventures of the Dutch. We joked about this man-made land. He said, it's so typically Dutch. We don't like a tree somewhere, we put it somewhere else. We need land, we take it from the water. According to his expertise, it would perhaps not be such a bad idea to embrace the natural dynamics of the ecosystem and see ourselves as an integral and not a hostile part of it. Thank you.